If you had have told me a few years ago that one of the most memorable, heartfelt, and completely unhinged superhero stories of the modern era would come from a spin-off about Peacemaker, the toilet seat helmet wearing jerk from a movie that was, let's be honest, just fine, I'd have called you insane. We're talking about a guy whose entire personality in the Suicide Squad boiled down to being a walking symbol of toxic patriotism and bad jokes. The last person you'd expect to carry an entire show, let alone one people actually cared about. And yet, here we are. Peacemaker not only exists, but it's left a genuine mark. In the current superhero wasteland where everything feels manufactured and algorithmic, this show stands out as something wild, personal, and somehow sincere. Now, cards on the table. I really enjoyed this series, but it's complicated. This isn't your easy by-the-numbers recent Marvel homework. It's a chaotic, foul-mouthed, glorious mess. One that swings for the fences every scene. Sometimes it nails it, but sometimes it faceplants in spectacular fashion. Because Peacemaker is built on contradiction. It's R-rated, it's juvenile, and relentlessly lewd. A fire hose of profanity and gore that would make even Deadpool blush.
Okay guys, let's get out there and make a difference.
But beneath all that madness lies a surprisingly deep story about trauma, friendship, masculinity, and redemption. And at the center of it all is John Cena, delivering the best performance of his career, equal parts stupid, sad, and sincere. That said, the flaws are real. The edgy humor can wear thin, the banter sometimes feels like Gunn parodying himself, and the attempt to fold this wild, R-rated fever dream into the new family-friendly DC universe, let's just say that's gonna get messy. I mean, very, very messy, but we'll get to that. So to untangle this bizarre explosive creation, we're diving deep into both seasons, starting with season 2, where the chaos finds focus, and then rewinding to the unfiltered madness that started it all. This is Peacemaker. Season 2 showed us that Peacemaker stops being just a wild, chaotic experiment and starts feeling like a show that actually knows what the hell it is. If Season 1 kicked the door down with a shotgun blast of glitter, profanity, and 80s hair metal, Season 2 is the moment it sits down in the rubble, cracks a beer, and starts telling you a story that's surprisingly coherent and, dare I say, mature. It's still loud, it's still bloody, and it's still deeply, deeply weird, but there's a newfound confidence here. The writing feels tighter, the character work is deeper, and James Gunn finally seems to have figured out how to balance the absurd humor with the genuine tragedy at the show's core. The single best thing about this season, without a shadow of a doubt, is the evolution of John Cena. Look, in season 1, he was a revelation. We all knew he had comedic timing, but nobody expected him to pull off the emotional vulnerability of a broken man-child trying to earn his father's love. It was impressive, but in season 2, he definitely worked harder to overcome his past achievements. The show puts him through the emotional ringer, forcing him to confront the full weight of his trauma, his guilt, and the horrifying realization that maybe, just maybe, he's the problem. There are scenes here where the jokes completely fall away and you're just left with Christopher Smith, a man so broken and so desperate for connection that it's honestly heartbreaking to watch. The raw, gut-wrenching confrontation with Adebayo in the finale where he just lets all that pain pour out is great acting. This isn't The Rock raising an eyebrow and cashing a check. This is a performer digging deep and delivering something real. Cena proves here that he has an emotional range that most of his blockbuster leading peers can only dream of. And it's not just Cena who levels up. The entire supporting cast, the self-proclaimed 11th Street Kids, gets so much more to do this season. From just a quirky ensemble reacting to Peacemaker's insanity, they're changed to a deeply dysfunctional makeshift family, each dealing with their own baggage. Amelia Hawkart's arc, dealing with trauma and loss of self-worth after the events of the first season, is an uncomfortable look at what happens after the big superhero battle is over. She's a nightmare to be around, pushing everyone away, especially Chris, but it comes from a place of real unresolved pain. Adebayo steps up and becomes the undeniable heart and soul of the team, the glue holding these broken people together. Her empathy is her true superpower, and her scenes talking Chris down from his emotional ledge are some of the most powerful in the entire series. Even Economos, the awkward dude whose main job in season 1 was being the butt of the joke about his dyed beard, gets a chance to mature. He's the first one to see through the bullshit and recognize the real threat, proving he's more than just comic comic relief. And then there's Vigilante. Adrian Chase is still the same goofy, sociopathic, and utterly hilarious wildcard, but by sidelining him just a little bit, his appearances become even more impactful. He's the perfect dose of chaos injected precisely when the show needs it most. The dynamic between these characters feels earned. When they stand together, you believe it because you've seen them go through hell together, and individually, it's a far more convincing family than the one Dominic Toretto mumbles about for 2.5 hours.
My family?
But the boldest swing this season takes is, without question, the fascist state twist. The reveal that the quantum chamber has been connecting them to Earth X, a universe where the Nazis won, is the kind of high-concept comic book insanity that could have easily fallen flat. Instead, it becomes this season's dark thematic core. It's a genuinely daring move, turning the show from a weird alien invasion story into a stark, uncomfortably relevant commentary on ideology and violence. The scenes on Earth X are bleak, and the writers pull no punches, showing us a world where Adebayo, a black woman, is forced into hiding. Gunn and his team managed to walk that incredibly fine line between dark comedy and actual horror, in a way that's reminiscent of something like Jojo Rabbit. The reveal that this alternate nightmarish world isn't as different from ours as we'd like to think adds a layer of genuine dread. This plotline forces Chris to confront the very nature of his mission. He sees firsthand that his mantra of achieving peace at any cost is the exact same logic that built this horrific world, and it shatters him. Of course, this is still a James Gunn joint, which means for every moment of brilliant character work, there's a stylistic choice that borders on self-indulgence. And man, we have to talk about the music. The soundtrack is once again wall-to-wall with deep-cut glam rock and hair metal tracks. It's stylish, it's cool, and it's an undeniable part of the show's identity. But holy hell is it overused. It feels like Gunn is so proud of his Spotify playlist that he's determined to cram a song into every single scene, whether it needs to be there or not. There are moments of quiet reflection or intense dialogue that are just completely drowned out by some obscure 80s power ballad. It stops being a stylistic choice and starts becoming a crutch. A relentless barrage of noise that honestly just gets exhausting. It's like being trapped in a car with a friend who refuses to turn the radio down. Yeah, the songs are cool, but sometimes you need a moment to breathe. So yeah, season 2 is a massive step up. It's more focused, it's emotionally richer, and it proves that this concept has legs beyond the initial shock value of its premise. It takes the best parts of season 1, the heart, the humor, the character-driven drama, and dials them up to 11. But that doesn't mean it's flawless. In fact, some of Gunn's signature moves started to wear a little thin here, and it's here that we need to talk about the show's most glaring weak spots. Now look, I know I just spent a good chunk of time praising how season 2 leveled up, and I stand by that, but let's not pretend this season is some kind of untouchable masterpiece, because it's not. It's a classic case of a filmmaker getting so high on his own supply that he doubles down on his worst habits, and while that confidence gave us some incredible character moments, it also amplified the show's most glaring and honestly most exhausting flaws. This is where the James Gunn formula starts to show its cracks, and man, some of these cracks are big enough to drive a tank through. First and foremost, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The show's desperate, almost pathetic attempt to be the edgiest thing on television. In season 1, the R-rated humor felt shocking and for the most part, weirdly refreshing. It was a middle finger to the sanitized, family-friendly landscape of superhero media, where almost all projects, despite Deadpool and The Boys, were fully PG-13. But in season 2, it often feels less like rebellion and more like a desperate cry for attention. The infamous orgy scene in the first episode is the perfect example. Not clever, not subversive, just a shameless, almost laughably transparent parody of the Herogasm episode from The Boys. It feels like Gunn saw what Eric Kripke did, got jealous and decided to make his own version, but without any of the satirical bite. It's just shock for shock's sake. It's seen so over the top and pointless that it comes off as a detestable and frankly, a little pathetic. It's the kind of try-hard, edgy humor you'd expect from a kid in high school who just learned how to swear. And that brings me to the profanity. Yes, this is an R-rated show. I get it, but there's a point where constant swearing stops being punctuating and just becomes white noise. The dialogue is so saturated with F-bombs and crude insults that it loses all impact. It's supposed to be raw and unfiltered, but it ends up feeling lazy, like the writers couldn't think of a cleverer line so they just threw in another swear word. The generic James Gunn banter where characters go off on these long, rambling, and ultimately pointless tangents is cranked up to 100 here too. It's fun at first, but after the 10th time a serious conversation is derailed by an argument about something completely completely ridiculous. You just want to scream at the screen. Get on with it. It's a shtick, and by season 2, it's a shtick that's starting to get really, really old. Then there's the over-reliance on style over substance. Now, I already touched on the music, but it bears repeating. The soundtrack in this season is a weapon, and it's being wielded with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Every single moment, no matter how small, is punctuated by a glam metal anthem. A character walks into a room, power ballad. They open a fridge, guitar solo. It's suffocating. It's as if Gunn doesn't trust his own writing or his actors' performances to carry a scene, so he just plasters music over everything to manufacture a mood. And that new opening credit sequence? Look, the first one was iconic, a perfect slice of unskippable deadpan brilliance. This new one is just an embarrassing war crime. It's a mess of awkward dancing that tries to recapture the magic but just ends up looking like a cheap knockoff. But the most fundamental problem with season 2, the one that truly holds it back, is its clumsy and incoherent connection to the wider DCU. This is where the whole project just falls apart at the seams. Placing this ultra-violent, morally ambiguous, and sexually explicit show as a direct sequel to a supposedly hopeful and inspiring Superman movie is one of the most baffling strategic decisions I have ever seen from a major studio. It's a full-blown narrative car crash. How are we supposed to believe that these are the same characters that will interact with a classic, kid-friendly Superman? Like, it creates a universe that feels fundamentally broken and inconsistent from day one. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't build a cohesive cinematic universe where your two flagship projects feel like they come from different planets. This is where the accusation of nepotism also starts to feel a little less like fan whining and a little more like valid criticism. By refusing to do a full clean slate reboot and instead carving out a special exception for his own pet project, a project that happens to star his wife and brother again and again, Gunn is compromising the integrity of the entire DCU. It feels less like a decision made to keep his own passion project alive, no matter how little sense it makes in the grand scheme of things. The whole multiverse plotline with Earth X, while providing some great character moments, also feels like a tired trope. In a world already fatigued by multiversal shenanigans, introducing it this early in your own universe just feels uninspired. It's a bog standard, predictable formula that we've all seen a dozen times before. But finally, the narrative itself isn't without its issues. The pacing in the first half of the season is painfully slow. It's all set up, a series of ruminatory character moments that, while well acted, drag the momentum to a screeching halt. And the finale, after all that build up, is surprisingly underwhelming. It's more interested in setting up chess pieces for future DCU projects than it is in delivering a satisfying conclusion to its own story. It feels more like a feature-length post-credit scene. Even some of the new characters, like the new Argus head, Sasha Bordeaux, feel incredibly one-note and cliched. She's a walking trope of the tough, no-nonsense boss who adds absolutely nothing to the dynamic. So while season 2 is a more mature and cohesive show than its predecessor, it's also a show that is weighed down by its creator's worst impulses and a series of questionable strategic decisions that threaten to undermine not just itself, but the entire future of the DCU. It's a great season of television that is constantly at war with itself, and that conflict is what makes it both fascinating and deeply frustrating. Alright, so before Peacemaker found its more mature, character-driven footing in Season 2, it was something else entirely. It was a glorious, unhinged, and completely unpredictable fever dream. Season 1 was a statement. It was James Gunn completely unshackled from the constraints of a PG-13 universe, unleashing every bizarre, juvenile, and R-rated impulse he's ever had directly onto our screens. This was pure, uncut chaos, a visceral and often overwhelming cocktail of gore, profanity, and the kind of stupidly brilliant humor that leaves you questioning your own sanity for laughing at it. Let's be real, this show should never have worked. It was a spin-off centered on arguably the most detestable character from the Suicide Squad, a guy we last saw literally murdering Rick Flag in cold blood. He was an irredeemably awful person, the world's biggest douchebag, and the idea of making him the hero of his own story seems like a creative dead end. But somehow, against all odds, Gunn and Cena pulled it off. They took this embodiment of toxic masculinity and transformed him into one of the most compelling and, dare I say, lovable idiots in modern television. From the very first episode, the show goes hardcore. It doesn't waste a single second easing you into its world. It's an immediate onslaught of blood, sex, and the kind of visceral, head-exploding violence that makes you flinch. Unlike the clean, bloodless action of the MCU projects, Peacemaker is a messy, uncomfortable, and intentionally hard to watch at the moment. Gunn makes it painfully clear that these characters aren't just quippy heroes, they are cold-blooded killers, and the violence has real gut gut-churning consequences. The show's tone is just relentlessly irreverent. It's a dark comedy that operates on a level of absurdity that feels like a live-action cartoon. This is a world where a bald eagle named Eagly gives heartfelt hugs, and is treated with the same emotional sincerity as a character grappling with childhood trauma. It's incredibly stupid in the best possible way. And at the center of this hurricane of insanity is John Cena. His performance in season 1 was nothing short of a pleasant surprise. He completely commits to the absolute idiocy of Christopher Smith, delivering some of the most ridiculous lines with a straight-faced sincerity that is just hysterical. His comedic timing is impeccable, but what truly makes his performance special is the vulnerability he brings to the character. Beneath the layers of muscle, bravado, and offensive t-shirts, there's a deeply broken and lonely man. The moments where the facade cracks and he breaks down in tears are heartbreaking. You see this emotionally stunted child who is still desperately trying to escape the shadow of his monstrous father. It's this heart, this raw, exposed nerve of pain that makes the whole ridiculous enterprise work. You shouldn't root for this guy, but you do, because you see the damaged human being underneath the toilet seat helmet. The structure of season 1 is also one of its greatest strengths. Unlike the more ruminatory and sometimes meandering pace of season 2, the first season is a tightly paced, propulsive mystery. Project Butterfly gives the show a clear sense of direction from the get-go. There's a central question that needs to be answered, and the tension builds with each new reveal. It's one of the better paced superhero shows, never feeling bloated or stretched out. It tells its story, resolves its central conflict, and sets up just enough for the future without getting bogged down in continuity. It exists in its own little bubble, free from the burden of setting up a cinematic universe, and it was so much stronger for it. Now, of course, you can't talk about season 1 without mentioning its stylistic overload, and it all starts with those opening credits. The deadpan robotic dance to Wigwam's Do You Want to Taste It is a stroke of genius. It perfectly encapsulates the show's entire vibe: absurd, hilarious, and strangely hypnotic. Gunn himself said he wanted to create an intro that was unskippable, and he absolutely succeeded. It's a mission statement, a signal to the audience to leave their expectations at the door and just embrace the weirdness. And the soundtrack, much like in season 2, is an integral part of the show's DNA. It's a non-stop barrage of 80s glam metal and cock rock that serves as the perfect score for the on-screen mayhem. It's loud, it's obnoxious, and it fits for this show, yet surely not for all of the viewers. The chemistry of the supporting cast was also firing on all cylinders from day one. The complicated, almost romantic bromance between Peacemaker and Vigilante is one of the best and funniest relationships in the entire season. And the slow burn antagonistic respect that develops between Chris and Amelia Harcourt has a genuinely compelling chemistry. This was an ensemble that just clicked, making the moments of downtime and banter just as entertaining as the explosive action sequences. Season 1 was an experiment that paid off in a massive way. It took a one-note villain and gave him a soul. It blended genres in a way that was just exhilarating to watch. It was a show that was unapologetically itself, flaws and all. But it's in that raw experimental energy that you find the show's greatest strength. It was a pleasant surprise that proved you could tell a deeply emotional story in the midst of utter and complete madness. However, beneath all of that surface level chaos, there were some surprisingly deep themes at play, ideas that would carry through and become the entire foundation of the series. Now, it would be easy to dismiss Peacemaker as just a bunch of dick jokes and exploding heads. And to be fair, it is absolutely that. But if you look past the gore and the relentless profanity, you'll find that James Gunn has smuggled some surprisingly profound and uncomfortable ideas into this Trojan horse of a comedy. The madness is a mask, a loud, obnoxious, and blood-soaked shield that the show used to hide a deeply broken and tragic heart. The humor is there to make you laugh, but also makes the tragedy palatable. The entire show is built around one central glorious irony: the character of Peacemaker himself. His life's mission, his entire identity, is a philosophical contradiction. This is a man who genuinely believes he's a hero, a force for good in the world, whose life is dedicated to achieving peace. And he plans to achieve that peace by killing anyone who gets in his way. He is, as the show itself points out, a super piece of shit, who is obnoxiously oblivious to the moral hypocrisy of his own existence. A hero who has convinced himself that this body count is justified. The show never lets him off the hook for this either. It constantly forces him, and by extension the audience, to confront the horrifying reality of what it would actually take to be a person like this. This isn't like Batman, who operates under a strict no-kill rule to maintain his moral high ground. No, Peacemaker gets his hands dirty, and the show unflinchingly shows us the bloody, brutal consequences of his peace-at-any-cost philosophy. And where does this twisted worldview come from? Well, that brings us to the show's most powerful and uncomfortable theme: toxic masculinity and the cyclical nature of trauma. Christopher Smith at first looks like like a product of his own bad decisions, but in fact, he is the product of a lifetime of psychological abuse at the hands of his father, Augie Smith, the White Dragon. Augie is a literal Nazi, a white supremacist, a monster who has spent his entire life molding his son into a weapon. Every racist, sexist, and homophobic belief that spews out of Peacemaker's mouth was drilled into him from childhood. He was raised in a crucible of hate, and the show does a masterful job of showing how that kind of upbringing shatters a person's soul. And this is what makes the character so tragically compelling. You hate the things he says and does, but you can't help but feel a sliver of sympathy for the broken little boy inside who was never given a chance to be anything else. Cena's performance is key here. The moments where he cries not like a man but like a child who has been hurt are genuinely devastating. He sells the deep internal pain of a man who is at war with the very person he was raised to be. He's an Archie Bunker on steroids, a far-right nutjob who is also just a desperately sad and lonely human being. This exploration of trauma gets even darker and more relevant in season 2 with the Earth X storyline. By throwing Chris into a world literally run by Nazis, the show forces him to confront the ultimate shadow of his father's ideology. Not like some abstract threat, no, a real-world manifestation of everything he was taught to believe. The episode's central theme, that violence only begets more violence, hits him like a freight train. He sees his own twisted logic reflected back at him on a global scale, and it breaks him. The observation that this Nazi-run world isn't as different from ours as we'd like to think is a chilling and powerful piece of social commentary that elevates the show beyond simple superhero parody. It's a dark, ugly, and necessary look at how easily hate can take root. And this is where the show's unique blend of humor and heart becomes so crucial. Gunn uses absurdity as a delivery mechanism for these heavy themes. A heartbreaking scene of Peacemaker playing a hair metal ballad on the piano, pouring out all his pain and regret shouldn't work, but it does. A touching moment where Adebayo explains how her entire worldview was changed by seeing an eagle hug a man sounds ridiculous on paper, but in the context of the show, it's a beautiful and weirdly profound expression of finding hope in the midst of chaos. The show constantly marries these bizarre, high-concept ideas with the emotional, honest, and relatable character moments. It's a tightrope walk that could have easily gone wrong, but for the most part, Gunn pulls it off. Now, not everyone buys into this. Some argue that the show is just a shallow parody, that it's trying too hard to be The Boys without any of the clever satire. They see the edgy humor not as a tool, but as a crutch, and accuse Gunn of becoming a caricature of himself, repeating the same tricks he's used in his other projects. And to be honest, there are moments where that feels valid. The show does, at times, feel like it's indulging in its own edginess a little too much, as I mentioned earlier. But for me, the thematic depth outweighs the occasional missteps. It's a show with a deep, often painful, and surprisingly thoughtful exploration of what it means to be a hero in a world that is anything but peaceful. It's a show that asks tough questions and isn't afraid to leave you feeling uncomfortable with the answers. And that, in a genre that so often plays it safe, is something to be admired. Look, I'm going to be brutally honest here. Despite all of the good words, the decision to make Peacemaker Season 2 a cornerstone of the new DCU is one of the most creatively bankrupt and strategically baffling moves I've seen from a major studio in a long time. It's a decision that undermines the integrity of the show itself and at the same time threatens to poison the well of the entire DCU before it even has a chance to get started. So let's rewind a bit. Season 1 of Peacemaker was a miracle precisely because it existed in its own little pocket universe. It was a weird, R-rated experiment that was allowed to be its own thing, completely unshackled from the burden of continuity. Sure, it was a spin-off of the Suicide Squad, but it never felt like homework. It was a self-contained story about a group of broken people, and it worked because it was focused. The now infamous Justice League cameo at the end of Season 1 was the perfect example of this. It was a funny throwaway gag that added absolutely nothing to the plot, and in doing so, it just proved how little the show actually needed the wider universe to succeed. But now everything has changed. James Gunn, the architect of this beautifully strange show, is also the architect of the entire DCU. And in what could only be described as a massive conflict of interest, he's decided to make his own pet project not just part of the new universe, but a vital, unmissable piece of it. He has literally called Season 2 the most importantest thing to watch, right after the big, shiny, family-friendly Superman movie. Like, are you kidding me? This is the strategic vision? A wholesome, all-ages Superman adventure, followed immediately by a drug-fueled orgy flapping boobies and jokes about camel toes. It feels like a complete and total breakdown of narrative coherence. It just doesn't fit. You're asking the general audience to accept that the irreverent, foul-mouthed psychopaths in this show exist in the same world as the hopeful, inspiring hero you just introduced. Like you're telling me that the characters like Maxwell Lord and Hawkgirl can appear in a classic comic booky Superman film and then show up in this R-rated cesspool without it feeling completely and utterly jarring. It's a massive, unnecessary risk that jeopardizes the mainstream appeal of the entire brand for the sake of one show. And the way the show tries to retrofit itself into this new continuity is a bit of a mess. It has to perform these awkward narrative gymnastics to erase the parts of its own history that no longer fit. The original Justice League is gone, replaced by the Justice Gang in a clumsy retcon. The show has to acknowledge that it's now in a universe where Lex Luthor just attacked Superman, while still holding onto the baggage of its own past, like Peacemaker having murdered Rick Flag in the old DCU. It's all mixed up, a confusing soup of old and new canon that just leaves you scratching your head. And for the love of God, did we really need to dive headfirst into the multiverse in the second major project of this new universe? We are all so sick and tired of the multiverse. It's a tired, bog-standard trope that has been done to death, and introducing it this early just feels lazy and uninspired. It screams of a lack of fresh ideas, a desperate attempt to follow a trend rather than set one, and more strange that it's a James Gunn attempt. The tragic irony here is that Peacemaker is at its best when it's ignoring the wider universe and focusing in on its own story. It's a character piece, a deep dive into the broken psyche of its protagonist. It doesn't need to be an interlocking cog in a larger machine, but by making it essential viewing, Gunn is turning it into exactly that. He's turning a great show into homework, forcing audiences to watch this incredibly niche R-rated series just to keep up with the main plot. And as we've seen with the MCU, that is the fastest way to create audience fatigue and resentment. Now, I've heard the argument that this tonal diversity is a strategic strength, that it mimics the way different comic books can have different styles, and in theory, that's a fine idea, but in practice, for a cinematic universe that is trying to win back the trust of a skeptical general audience, it's suicide. You need to establish a consistent, accessible foundation before you can start getting weird in the margins. By leading with this, you're not showing diversity, you're showing a lack of cohesive vision. You're alienating a massive chunk of your potential audience right out of the gate. This entire situation feels like a symptom of Gunn's own limitations. He's a filmmaker with a very specific, very repetitive style, and by forcing that style into the core of the DCU, he's potentially hamstringing the entire universe before it even starts. Peacemaker should have been allowed to remain its own beautifully weird standalone thing. By trying to make it the linchpin of this new universe, Gunn is not only doing a disservice to the show itself, but he's also taking a massive, unnecessary gamble on the future of DC, and I'm not convinced it's a gamble that's going to pay off. So, to bring this one all home, where does that leave us with Peacemaker? After all the blood, the guts, the glitter, and the emotional breakdowns, what are we left with? Well, we're left with one of the most unapologetically strange, ridiculously bizarre, and genuinely heartfelt projects to ever come out of the superhero genre. This show is an absolute blast, a chaotic triumph of character-driven storytelling that succeeds in spite of its creator's worst impulses and its own questionable place in the grand scheme of things. It's a show that is so much better than it has any right to be, and that is almost entirely down to one man, John Cena. Let's be real, Cena's performance is the anchor that holds this entire insane enterprise together. He took a character who was a one-note joke and turned him into a deeply compelling, tragic, and surprisingly lovable figure. He proves that he's a far more authentic and versatile comedic actor than someone like The Rock, who has been coasting on the same stale persona for the last decade, even though he has actually tried to branch out recently. But Cena isn't afraid to look stupid, to be vulnerable, or to be utterly detestable. He commits, and that commitment is what sells the whole damn thing. The supporting cast is equally memorable, a found family of lovable misfits that you genuinely grow to care about. The tone is unique, the humor is relentless, and for all its flaws, it's a show that is never ever boring. But man, those flaws are hard to ignore. The relentless R-rated edginess often crosses the line from being subversive to just being juvenile and exhausting. The over-reliance on the soundtrack, while stylish, can be suffocating, and the constant barrage of profanity sometimes feels more like a lack of creativity than a bold stylistic choice. But the show's single greatest weakness remains its clumsy, forced connection to the DCU, a decision that feels like a strategic blunder that threatens to hamstring the entire universe. At the end of the day, Peacemaker is a show that is constantly at war with itself, full of opposites, brilliant character study trapped inside a juvenile action comedy, poignant exploration of trauma that's frequently interrupted by dick jokes, a standalone masterpiece that's being forced to be a puzzle piece in a universe it doesn't quite fit into. It's just James Gunn being James Gunn for better and for worse. So, is this show one of the nicest things to come out of the superhero genre in recent years? More so, yes. Is it a deeply flawed, often frustrating and stylistically indulgent mess? Yeah, you bet your ass it is. But in a landscape dominated by safe, formulaic and utterly soulless content, I'll take a glorious, ambitious and beautifully broken mess like this any day of the week. At least it has a goddamn soul, and in the end, maybe that's the only kind of peace worth fighting for. Eagly would approve. Now, if you're new around here and you want more unfiltered takes on everything from the MCU to Star Wars and whatever other glorious train wrecks Hollywood throws at us, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. Let me know your thoughts on Peacemaker down in the comments below. I'm keen to hear what you guys think. But until next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.